Teachers of Reddit, what's the dumbest essay assignment you've ever received? Students were asked to write a literacy narrative where they discussed something or someone who impacted them as a reader and/or writer. In his first draft, one of my students wrote about having sex with a girl in the closet of his high school's band room. In my feedback, I reminded him that the topic had to relate to his literacy. He added a paragraph in his next draft explaining how it made him a better writer because it gave him a topic for the paper and it improved his ability to be descriptive because he told the story in vivid detail to many of his friends. There are dead things here and the soil looks like it's washed away. Rivers here are nice and so is the weather. This is a nice place. Full essay response. It was supposed to be a 10-page paper, with charts and graphs and etc. My roommate was the teacher for this, and it's a college course. This student sounds like a mix of Annie Wilkes from Misery and Lena from Of Mice and Men. I never really understood people who go to college to just fuck off. Sure, you basically have to do K-12, so a lot of people just goof off until they are able to drop out. But college is totally voluntary. There's probably still young adults that are forced into it by their parents that have no interest in being there. And that student's name? Ernest Hemingway. The trees were fine and good and the water was cold and bright. The world was true and the leaves were brown. For sale. Baby shoes. Never worn. There were short blog posts due weekly, each worth 1% adding up to 10 by the end of the semester. On the last week a student posted the entire B-movie script. I'd put money down that they probably did the math and could easily spare the last point. I once had a cybersecurity professor hide a character from a sequence in every poster for this public lecture he was doing. When put together and decrypted, it was a low-bit RSA, so we brute forced it. It was some URL. The URL took us to a GitHub page containing the entire script for the B-movie. In undergrad there was a rich kid who used to pay me to write his papers for a bullshit intro creative writing type class. Anyway, we had a decent arrangement. $75 paid with a $50 bonus if I got an A. On one paper he screwed me on the money because the assignment was 4 pages minimum and I wrote 5. He didn't think he should have to pay the extra page, as it was over the minimum. On top of that I found out he had gotten an A and told me it was a straight B. I was super pissed, so for the next assignment I wrote a 3-page piece on how 70s porn legend John Holmes and his giant penis was his hero, discussed Holmes' tragic life, and then dedicated a page plus to discussing how he purchased a John Holmes endorsed penis pump and how often he worked at growing his small penis. I made no effort to make the paper sound like him and the assignment had nothing to do with the topic. I just wanted him to go along thinking the work was covered and then read it and have to write one himself last minute. Well, he never read it, just turned it in. The following week the teacher handed it back and made him read it to the class, and we never worked together again. Fuck you, Pete. You still owe me $125. I never really got that. You're paying to get a class only so you can pay to not actually do the class. What's the point of that? He didn't want to go to college but his parents made him. He ended up bailing in year 2 after his grandfather died and he inherited a chunk. Most people want the degree, not the knowledge. And even if you want the knowledge, you might not be interested in every single mandatory class you have to take. The first history essay I ever graded was back in teacher training about Sino-Us relations in the 1900s. It started something like relations between the US and China were real tense during the 20th century. The worst bit was definitely when China attacked Pearl Harbor and the US retaliated with 2 nuclear bombs. This was followed by a lot of good solid information and I had a hard time figuring out what a fair grade would be. Edit. Guess I can add a few more details since so many people were interested. The author of the essay was a first-year student in a Finnish lukio, which is usually translated as high school. He was probably 15-17 depending on the time of year and his birthday. It was the type of essay where you sit down for an exam and write down everything you know about the topic without books or notes. So plagiarism is pretty hard to pull off. It's much more likely that he mixed up some detail in a temporary brain fart, but remembered certain parts well because the teacher had explained it in a memorable way or he had just read it in a book the night before. This was some years ago, so I don't remember what grade the essay got. It wasn't my call anyway, since we teacher students were grading them as practice before discussing what we would have given each with their actual teacher. Oh, and I wasn't a teacher in the 1900s, although at least in the Finnish reckoning this statement would have been true even if I worked briefly in 1999. Similar to English, we don't have an awkward way of referring to the first decade of the last or current century. I wrote an essay in history that was cited up, well researched, and coherent, albeit totally sarcastic, about how the Jews killed Kennedy. My teacher gave it a 10/10 because of how well argued and researched it was. I would have given that essay something like 7 or 8 depending on the quality of arguments and how coherent the writing is, but still deducting for that blatant falsehood. I was proctoring a Rus History Regents exam for a student with test read and scribe modifications. The thematic essay had something to do with war. He coolly leaned back in his chair, cracked his knuckles, and proclaimed, "I got this." He began quickly dictating a rather elegant monologue that was well spoken, but way off topic. I had to ask him to slow down or repeat himself. He was a rather eclectic kid, but this was speech that was a bit out of his wheelhouse. After the exam I googled the first sentence of his essay. He plagiarized the entire opening monologue from Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. Cells are bad. My uncle lives in a cell. It's 10 foot by 12 and he has to read the same boring old magazine every day. The end. I mean the term for a biological cell was actually chosen because the first researchers who discovered cells in plants said they looked like the cells that monks lived in at monasteries. That was actually in reference to the poor structure of cork under a microscope. The name just stuck after microscopes got stronger because it wasn't worth coming up with a new term for segmented things seen through a microscope. I teach history at a local community college and you wouldn't believe some of the takes people have on historical figures. Being in the Deep South, I'm used to the ole Lincoln was a dictator and Sherman was a war criminal stuff. But ancient Rome was a black civilization probably takes the cake in terms of vagueness of sources and why on earth that needs to be debated in the first place. I took appreciation of theater in college and the professor would give us pop quizzes every couple of weeks. One week we were covering Shakespeare, and the extra credit question on the pop quiz was which American president was in office when Shakespeare was writing plays. 2 people answered Andrew Jackson and 3 people answered Lincoln. Professor was so fucking mad Mayo. 3 people answered Lincoln. Professor was so fucking mad. Of course the professor was mad. Lincoln had a very strained relationship with live theater. College course. Freshman orientation kind of thing. This is what college will demand for students who aren't quite ready for 101. Assigned them an introductory short essay about anything they wanted. Just something they are interested in. Let me see what I'm working with. One of the essays read, verbatim, I am interested in blueberry muffin. Like how they round on top and ripe on the side. That what I like, kept that one on my fridge. Edit. That was the entirety of the essay. It was a pass-fail course, and I was instructed that there were to be 0 failures. I think the actual paper is lost. This was 12 years, 2 moves, and a divorce ago. Serious question. Do students like that actually get through a degree program? Have you encountered anyone who improved their skills enough to be able to write decent papers and get through 4 years of coursework? I encountered a Chinese international student who was 10x worse than this in my mandatory freshman writing class. 1/2 our grade was a peer review of our final paper, and based on the scoring rubric we were given and common sense of what is acceptable in a top 50 American university, gave her a 5/100. The teacher made a huge fuss that I was discriminating against her, like it's my fault or systemic racism that she came to an English-speaking nation for college, supposedly had to pass an English proficiency test to be admitted, but could barely manage C-spot run levels of literacy and writing competency. Long story short, I was ultimately threatened by the dean of the liberal arts school to either give her an A and write her an apology, or I would fail the class and face disciplinary charges for violating the student code of conduct. I changed the grade but never apologized, which seemed to sate them, and I DK for certain. But I would put hard money down that student got the same degree I did. The thing that gets me really angry is she was an international student, meaning she had a family with money who lived a life of privilege in China and passed the proficiency test through $. But they acted like you were bullying an immigrant who'd had to fight poverty. But if some poor kid had trouble paying their bursar account, you bet they wouldn't be telling the bursar to give them an A anyway. I personally tutored 2 inner-city American students of color who had to drop out of college for losing a scholarship that required them to maintain a 3.7/4 GPA or higher. It wasn't like they weren't trying either. They put in the effort, got fucked on the curve, and still ended up past what the university deemed cum laude if they were to graduate with that same GPA. 3.7 is insane to expect 3.2, 3.3 sure, but they are basically gaming the scholarship so they can look good without actually helping. Yeah, they gave these 2 kids a scholarship knowing they'd never keep it, and now next year they can give it to 2 new kids. 2 new kids the next year, and 2 new kids a year after that. Now they can say that they allowed 8 inner-city minorities to go to college, for the cost of 2 NVM that nobody actually got a degree to take back to their community. Long story short, I was ultimately threatened by the dean of the liberal arts school to either give her an A and write her an apology, or I would fail the class and face disciplinary charges for violating the student code of conduct. Please give me that in writing along with a copy of the essay. I need to review it with counsel. Jesus. I was in a very competitive MBA program at a top-level university. More than half my class was Chinese, but half of them could not really speak or write English at first. I was in a group of 4 people, with 2 of them being these kinds of people. Very nice people with great work ethic, but I had to rewrite and present the entire project by myself because they were unable to read, write or speak English independently. It was super frustrating and we almost failed, but I went to the professor and explained the situation. She was very understanding, but man did that project suck. Later in the year though, they got way better and all of them have gone on to higher education and great jobs! It was just really difficult at first. Schools tend to charge international students more, just like out-of-state students. So it's about $. I can't speak for students at the I am interested in blueberry muffin level of English literacy, but I once reviewed a paper from a senior about to graduate with a degree in communications that was definitely written in English but was conceptually unintelligible. Edit. I want to clarify that this guy was a native English speaker, and was just really bad at organizing thoughts into coherent sentences. I had no idea how he'd passed the required writing class freshman year, much less how he was actually set to graduate with a communications degree. For some reason it seems perfectly normal for people to fail and repeat required math and science classes. But I have never anecdotally heard of really poor writers and communicators actually failing classes where clear written communication is supposed to be a requisite component. The only people who fail writing heavy classes seem to be the ones who don't bother to turn their papers in at all. So bad writers can slip through writing, literature, history, and philosophy classes as long as they turn something in with decent ideas. Even within lab science classes, students can churn out barely intelligible lab papers with little consequence as long as they structured their report correctly and their data was good. This filters out into the scientific world, where we have academic journal articles that are 10 times harder to read than they should be, even after taking into account the necessary levels of complexity and jargon. I've been trying to figure out what "right on the side" means for longer than I should. Do they mean that the stumps are darker, or that the part of the muffin top that spills over is a bit denser than the rest of it? I think they meant ribbed or rippled, referring to the wavy pattern on the side. What they were asked, a 1500-word essay about the impact of Milton Friedman on the evolution of monetary policy. There were sub-questions to guide their thinking responses. What I received: a couple of biographical facts about Friedman, followed by a 1500-word essay about the salmon industry in Chile. I have no fucking clue where that came from, but thanks to needing to grade on a curve, they still got 50%. I would have given them the lowest possible grade for a D, largely because that is hilarious and I love salmon. Maybe not what you're getting at, but some entertaining approaches to essays included a kid who turned in 3 pages with a sentence on each page. He said it meets the requirements for a 3-page essay, since nothing in the instructions said how many words had to be on each page. And the kid who put 4 pages of Wikipedia quotes, in quotes, and cited, and said that there was no limit to how much of the essay could be quotes. Apparently I get a bunch of future lawyers. I really like when kids do that to me. It's much easier to justify giving them a 0. You fulfilled the requirements. The essay just wasn't very good. Receiving a 0 is a sign that your teacher didn't even look at it, so you can laugh it off and redo it. Receiving a 13%, on the other hand, is a sign that the teacher read it and then called you crap. Source: How My College Professor Grades Essays. I couldn't do your job. I'm already sarcastic as it is, let alone if someone was that sarcastic to me. Couldn't you still give them a failing grade because those would be really bad essays? Sure, they met the requirements but they did a really bad job at the assignment. Couldn't you still give them a failing grade because those would be really bad essays? Absolutely. A grade 12 student who never showed up to class and never turned in any homework or assignments tried to breakfast club me with a heartfelt, personal essay on his final exam. He even tried to end it with "Mr. NFLDU Dirtown. I know this isn't what you were looking for, but it's what I know and feel." Yes, he capitalized feel. I still failed the shit out of him. Edit. Just to clarify, the final exam essay question wasn't about personal experiences. I asked them to either compare or contrast 1984 and Brave New World. His essay did neither of these things. It was about 7 years ago, but he didn't mention either book in any way. I took an integrated history and English class for my junior and senior years in high school. One time we were supposed to read All Quiet on the Western Front, but I had just started The Outsiders, so I just finished it instead. I fessed up to it. So my English teacher told me to read The Golden Years and compare and contrast them. He was the best. Considering Outsiders is at best a 7th grade level novel, that guy went super duper easy on you. T8 for my professor in college, who gave me a pretty standard rubric for grading papers. This one kid handed in a paper with 0 citations, which accounted for 1/4 of his grade according to the guidelines I was following. I handed back the papers and I was expecting flack from this kid since most people had gotten in the 90s. He came up to me and said, "So if I had cited anything I would have gotten a 99 instead of a 74." I said yup. He turned around and nodded. Got a 100 on his next paper. Follow directions, people. It's amazing that the kid was self-aware enough to realize that. Folks, hot tip for you: when your teacher gives you a grading rubric, structure your paper around the rubric. Everything else is pretty much secondary. For my high school junior English report, our teacher handed out a list of authors we could write about. She told us we could pick any of them, but if we picked Henry David Thoreau we would have a hard time because she hated Thoreau. All I knew about him at the time was that he was a naturalist, and had written Walden, which I'd just read and liked. So, I researched Thoreau, looking for reasons to dislike him, and I found so many. The best was that he started a 300-acre forest fire that came close to burning down the woods around Walden Pond a year before he built his cabin there, and would have destroyed the nearby town if the townsfolk hadn't acted quickly. There were lots of other things that made Thoreau look bad, and I put them all together in my report, along with citations and bibliography. When our teacher was returning the reports, she stated that only 3 students had picked Thoreau, and while the other 2 got passing grades, I got 100%. That experience pretty much laid the foundation for the rest of my education. Learn all you can, but give the person grading you what they want. I once had a student turn in a plagiarized essay. It was super obvious just from the weird shifts in language. They had matched the fonts and everything at least, but I did get a few that didn't. But they also left a hyperlink that they tried to disguise by removing the underlining and changing the color to black. I went to a fairly small high school. My graduating class was about 200 students. I was in AP English and have pretty much always loved research papers, book reports, essays, just whatever. So my junior year my boyfriend is in a different English class, but of course we share the same teacher, and he has an essay assignment he doesn't want to do, so I volunteer. I don't know why we thought we'd get away with this. We clearly had different aptitudes for writing. My teacher wrote on the top of the paper Anxetida Prasedvan, I am glad you understand. Boyfriend's reading assignment. Now, boyfriend, you only have 1 week to read this yourself. He never actually said anything to me, but I felt like dying a little every time I had to go to class. Eater. To everyone who thinks this was somehow me challenging them to how big is your school competition. I'm from DFW, so yes, in a relatively large metroplex, in an even larger state that is small. I appreciate that some schools have 5 students, but the US average high school has 752 students enrolled, so under that, yes, I considered small. Honestly, that was an awesome teacher. He could have easily failed you both. Like, It takes equal effort to copy and paste into Word. Right-click, and remove the hyperlink or change the text color and remove the underline. Why go to stupid route? Because 10th graders are stupid. Lol. Edit. More accurately, every kid thinks they know better than the teacher, especially when it comes to technology. The essay never got written, but it took way too long to explain why child sexual abuse was a terrible topic for a pro-con essay. Not that funny, but you'd be surprised how many times I have received a copied Wikipedia article, with formatting, links and all the same as they are in Wikipedia. I live in a non-English speaking country. One time, a immigrant student didn't know the word for firecracker, so they looked it up on a dictionary. That's good, but the word cracker has two meanings. They use the one that means the edible thing, not the one that is fired to the sky. The question was to name something that is an explosive. The words for cracker, the edible one, and cracker, fireworks, are nothing similar in my language, so I spent quite a while wondering what the student meant. Edit. Apparently cracker has more meanings than I thought. English is not my first language, so I wasn't aware of this. I worked a short stint, almost a full semester, as a substitute teacher to pay the bills. And some of the sub-jobs I took were multi-day ones that required me to grade papers. During one job, I got a group of 11th graders that were doing a history unit on the Holocaust. One of the assignments was a short essay research paper in reaction to a video about Auschwitz. One kid in the class wrote for her paper, "I don't understand why these people are going to this camp. It doesn't even look like it would be fun. There's no canoes or campfires." I wasn't really sure what to do in response, so I set her paper aside from the other students and left a note to her regular teacher to discuss it with her when they returned. For what that district paid subs, I knew I wasn't getting paid enough to deal with that situation. Honestly, the teacher herself probably wasn't being paid enough to deal with that situation. Maybe my state is special, but the yearly pay for new teachers is roughly the same as any other entry and master's level job, and the job security is significantly better. I don't know what state you're in, but a friend of mine in NJ dropped out of a doctoral program because the money she could make teaching elementary school far exceeded what she could ever have made teaching college. Well, yeah, college education was built on the idea that it's giving back to the university for its supporting your real job, research. Typical middle school English assignment of answering questions about a story. A student made up everything. The names and events were all different. He essentially wrote a new story in the form of answers to the questions. We had even read the story as a class. He tried to argue with me that he didn't make it up. I had another student copy someone else's answers and also tried to argue that he didn't. His argument was pretty sloppy though, considering he also copied the name of the student he cheated off of. I knew some people in my grade that bought the teacher's edition of a science textbook off of Amazon. At one point one of the answers they put down was, "Answers may vary." I had a social studies teacher in 8th grade that told us about her favorite plagiarism on a homework assignment. One student gave his buddy his homework to copy with the added note, "Don't copy everything word for word or she'll know at the bottom." The first student crossed that out after the fact to hide it. Of course, not only did his friend copy everything word for word, but he also copied the extra instructions from his friend verbatim and left it in the assignment. It's like those bot comments that aren't gilded but leave in the edits thanking people for gold. I had a student turn in a paper that I wrote and published on my own faculty page as an example for the assignment. He found it by googling my name and the title of the assignment. He didn't notice that it came from my own site. I guess he also didn't ever click on the link in the syllabus that took him straight to said side paper. Good times. Edit to add. Since so many people asked, my institution allows individual professors to make their own policies for academic dishonesty. I teach composition courses, the crux of which is citing sources. So I have a zero tolerance policy. He automatically failed my class, but that is the extent of my power. The institution offers the option to fill out miles of paperwork to document academic dishonesty. I do the exorbitant amount of work every time, despite being actively encouraged not to do so. If a student gets 3 such documented incidents, SC is expelled. Maybe he did click on the link in the syllabus and was like, hey, fucking score. I once had something similar as an undergrad. I did ridiculously well in a certain class, turning in 6 reports that all got 95% plus, averages in the 60-70s. The way the class was set up, we were split into 6 groups and would rotate between 6 experiments. So I gave every single one of my graded reports to my buddy, who was rotating to the experiment I had just finished. Then I passed my reports to another person in our research lab who was taking the class, then someone else. Now, the average report length for this class was about 20 pages. Mine were about 4 pages, because I used almost no text except to describe the math that was required. When I was in grad school teaching the same class, somebody turned my own reports into me. Plagiarism software only said about 10-20% because they had used their data in the Excel, which changed all the math. I didn't dock them points, because paperwork sucks and busting plagiarism means paperwork. But I did write a note to the site that says check the name on the papers you copy before you turn them in your name at the top of the reports you're copying. Edit. Since this appears to be a surprisingly popular post, plagiarism is surprisingly hard to prove, especially when plagiarism software detects such a low similarity. Just because the reports were written in the same short style does not mean conclusively that the previous work was copied, especially since there were no dead giveaways such as incorrect names. Sure, it was obvious, but not obvious enough where the student wouldn't have a solid chance at appeal, which means more time and energy spent on things I frankly don't care about. Kid only cheated themselves. The exams in this class were brutal. I had a Tang college accused me of self-plagiarism on one of my papers, like I copied my own work but the paper instructions were just as similar as my papers were written. I understand plagiarism. I never figured I'd get accused of plagiarizing myself lol. I was tutoring a college student who really wanted to write about an infinite energy machine he saw on YouTube as a serious topic for a research essay on renewable power. I eventually told him that if he could find peer-reviewed sources we could. We looked for pretty much the whole hour. He then explained to me that there aren't any because of conspiracy. I knew a guy at uni who had an idea that he thought would make him rich. You know how light dissipates diminishes over distance? Well, I don't remember the exact equation but somewhere in there you divide by d. He thought that if he could get the distance down to 0, then dividing the intensity by 0 would give you infinite energy. Took me ages to convince him to tell me, because he thought I'd steal his idea. I didn't have the heart to correct him. Theoretically, this would also be true in a perfect vacuum. Now you just need a way to maintain a perfect vacuum and convert energy to and from light without losing energy. Oh, for that all you need is a duck, a microwave oven, some duct tape and a 3-bean burrito. Where people go wrong is they put 3 types of beans in the burrito when it's supposed to be exactly 3 beans, all lima. Was he asking to write about the theory of a perpetual motion machine? Or did he actually believe someone built something that produces infinite energy? There are a lot of research papers on Google Scholar about PMMs and the theory behind them. And of course, why they are impossible. He was assigned a paper on renewable energy sources. He wanted to write about a machine that pulled infinite electricity from air with no input based on a ton of YouTube scams about no more energy bills. Pay $300 and we'll teach you how to DIY a magic generator that you can put in your basement and have infinite electricity forever. Everyone knows all you need is a surge protector plugged into itself. Duh. High school English teacher here. A while back I assigned my students a writing assignment in which they had to make up their own creation myth. As we had read some creation myths from different cultures around the world and made note of their similarities and differences. Basically, they had to tell me how something natural in our world was first created. My favorite essay was titled "Why Are Trees?" or something to that effect. The entire paper was just one sentence. I can't remember exactly, but I think it was something along the lines of, "Seriously, trees, why are they?" I laughed. I cried. I gave them a 0 and moved on. Edit. Happy you are all enjoying the story as much as I did when it happened to me. For everyone worried about the student, or upset that I didn't give them any pity points, I can put your minds at ease. I hope. I was close with this student. We both had a similar sense of humor, and each of us had a good rapport with the other. This was their way of making me laugh while also admitting they procrastinated and didn't have time to actually do the assignment. I talked with them the next day, had a laugh, and allowed them some extra time to complete the essay for real. This was also at the beginning of the year, and by the end of it all they passed my class with a B. I'm also enjoying the number of people trying to decide whether or not I'm their current past teacher by looking through my post history. This has been entertaining. Why did I never have fun prompts? My most fun essay prompt was "You're reading your autobiography. What is on page 52? To which I basically said that it would be a story about an oddly specific English essay prompt I got in high school about exactly this scenario. Shit was meter. Got a 100. Someone turned this script web page in for and recommend a systems class at my college. Supposedly it got an A. Holy crap. I literally laughed out loud because of this. Definitely A for effort and A for not giving a shit of what other people think. Worth scrolling through this thread for 10 minutes just to stumble across this gem. Had a freshman in a college level biology course, human sexuality, turn in an essay talking about his first period. We called the guy in just to make sure we weren't being gender biased before failing him. Definitely a bio male. Definitely identified as male. Definitely a plagiarist. Welcome to college, kid. I mean, at that point why not just lie? What could you have done if he said he was a trans guy? When I was in college, some dude selected a topic for an assignment relating to the Biggie Tupac debacle. He played Tupac's song and Biggie's song, and stated something along these lines. We see the conflict portrayed through Tupac's words regarding Biggie, stating "That's why I fucked your bitch, you fat motherfucker." I was crying laughing in the class. A student of mine once gave an assignment on black holes, in black font, on a black background. He emailed me a completely black Word document. My senior English class, we had to read Lord of the Flies. There was one day where we didn't have to attend for whatever reason, but the teacher told us ahead of time that she would be reviewing with questions directly from the final exam. A friend of mine and myself both attended. But this one girl who always bummed answers off my friend did not. Somehow, this girl found out that one of the questions was explained the irony at the end of the book. The children are rescued by a military ship, which had itself been off killing people before. But it's depicted as a symbol of civilization and order. She told my friend that she hadn't read the whole book, and asked what happened. He told her this story about how a helicopter comes and flies the kids off the island. But as they're leaving, a submarine surfaces and shoots down the helicopter. Everyone dies. It's ironic that they were so close to safety and still died. When everyone passed the tests forward, he saw her paper and she actually wrote about submarines and shooting down helicopters and how sad the ending was. Explained the irony at the end of the book. The children are rescued by a military ship, which had itself been off killing people before. But it's depicted as a symbol of civilization and order. My 7th grade English teacher told me that it was because the children immediately regain their senses, and that the reader is forced back to a more civilized viewpoint. I thought this was not ironic at all. Just good writing that juxtaposes the situation with and without the military ship. But I was a 7th grader, so I just decided whatever. Cue me, in 10th grade, needing the teacher to explain to me that this was in fact not what was ironic and not really irony at all. In a series of events that is the polar opposite of yours, my dad read To Kill a Mockingbird in high school and then briefly explained it to his friend who hadn't read it right before they walked into class to write a timed report on it. My dad is pissed off to this very day because the other kid who didn't read it got a better grade than he did. Not my story, but I have a friend that is an English teacher at one of those alternative high schools for the at-risk students. One of the assignments required students to write about anything in their school journals every morning. This one stubborn student spent a whole trimester writing a whole page of blah, blah, blah every entry. Edit. Word 'cause tired. Former teacher here. Assigned papers to a 10th grade class about pre-WW2 Germany, so from 1919 to 1937. I provided topics and they had to choose one. A kid named Brent picked Nazi Party. Brent was the son of a fairly wealthy business owner in the area and had probably never had to apply himself at anything. He was a skinny white kid who thought he'd be a rapper someday. But he was super excited when he saw that topic and picked it right away. I was sort of skeptical, but was just happy he was actually interested in something school related. The paper was one page on the topic, just biographic info. Brent turns in, to my surprise, not just a full page, but 2 more pages stapled onto the back. Lo and behold, I was treated to a glorious page of writing titled Wejet in Krunk at the Nazi Party. It was basically a summary of how he'd plan a party, complete with booths, girls and modern day celebrities. There was a line that literally said bitches be on Adolf's dong for weeks. He even added some of his own rap lyrics. Oh, and the 2 extra pieces of paper, a full page picture with a bottle of Bacardi while the other page just contained a single word centered. It read Parteiisel. Brent was later expelled for threatening staff by saying he's bringing a gun to school. Bonus Brent story. Brent decided one day he would drink milk with lunch. Being lactose intolerant, my 4-RTH period his bowels were in rebellion. We were working on a timeline for WW1 and in the middle of another student asking a question, he ripped a huge drawn-out fart. He tried to blame it on his chair, which might have been convincing had the room not filled with the smell of shit. He then got upset and embarrassed and stormed out of the room yelling I drank milk. He later came back escorted by the assistant principal who found him kicking the vending machine. Bonus 2. In my school there was a floater teacher. who didn't have a classroom but pushed around a cart to various other rooms while those teachers had their prep period. Brent thought he'd like to ride this cart. I didn't actually witness it, but he rode the cart out the door of a classroom and creamed the wall on the other side of the hall, knocking pretty much everything out of the cart. He then tried to hide in the drama room, which might have worked, but he became bored and turned on the TV and was rapping along to music videos when they found him. This incident led to Brent being sent to in-house suspension for 3 days, where he put a gum wrapper on a paper clip into a power outlet because he wanted to test something. This is the funniest thing I've ever read with my own 2 eyes. Bless you. Obligatory, not a teacher, and can't be positive that this is true, but it's funny and I want it to be true. It's been nearly 10 years since I took the ACT test. At the time, they had an optional writing portion where they gave you a prompt to write about. I didn't know it at the time, but supposedly these were just suggested writing prompts. Apparently you could write about whatever you want and they will just grade it on your essay structure and other things of the like. I totally forgot what the prompt was, but my friend wrote about how the Jetsons is the most socially destructive cartoon in history, and somehow he tied in the theory of the Jetsons and the Flintstones taking place in the same universe, and even at the same time in history. He basically talked about how the Jetsons normalized the idea of an extreme wealth gap and displayed to Americans that it's okay to totally ignore people's problems if they are in a different economic class than you. He mentioned how the Jetsons were fully aware of the Flintstones at the time and how the Flintstones were committing genocide on the dinosaurs. In season 1 of the Flintstones, Dino was an intelligent creature that displayed human qualities and was even able to speak English. In season 2, Dino was unable to speak and was often used in slave labor like the rest of the dinosaurs at the time. This suggests that dinosaurs were intelligent creatures until the Flintstones started committing genocide on them or something and forcing terrible experiments, such as lobotomies, on dinosaurs to make them more compliant slaves. He said that the Jetsons were fully aware of the atrocities being committed by the Flintstones, something about a crossover episode, and chose not to do anything because it didn't affect them. He was saying how everyone in the Jetsons were rich, and everyone in the Flintstones were poor, and since the dinosaurs were even poorer than the Flintstones, the Jetsons saw no reason to concern themselves with these atrocities. At the time, there was a genocide in Sudan going on. He managed to tie that into his essay and talked about how the Jetsons gave Americans an excuse to essentially not care about the genocide because it was happening so far away from them and the people being killed were significantly poorer than us. The part of this story that I do know is true is that he scored higher than 98% of the country on the writing portion. Like honestly, if he managed to tie it in well to Sudan, that's fucking amazing. Still better than what someone in my school did. Now, he wasn't the sharpest light bulb in the shed, but had some Rain Man abilities. When we took the ACT, he stared at it for 20 minutes then proceeded to consume the test, bite by bite, page by page. He supposedly ate the staples too, but I'm not too sure on that. Holy Mother of God. Imagine being one of the 98% who got beat by an essay about the Jetsons. Outline assignment for a speech class. Student literally turns in the following. I. Intro. 2. Body. 3. Conclusion. They put their name on it and everything. My students were supposed to pick a 20th century independence leader and write a biography. Someone was supposed to cover Pakistan's independence leader Mohammed Ali Jinnah. I got a biography on Cassius Clay. When I did GCSE PAY many years ago, we spent a lesson discussing the importance of rise, rest, ice, compression, elevation, For sports injuries, our homework was to write an essay about rice. One kid clearly hadn't listened to a word of the lesson, because he handed in 2 pages all about the different types of rice you can buy in the supermarket, how to cook it, and what he and his family like to eat alongside rice for dinner. Never seen a teacher laugh so much before. I teach public speaking at a university. My second assignment is a video speech. This forces my students to really watch themselves speak and gives them an opportunity to turn in their best take. It's usually a great booster because of the ability to turn in your best version. I had a student give a speech where he belched louder than I'd ever heard in the middle of a sentence and said shit about 3 times, and went grossly over the time constraints. Just consider, for a moment, that this was their best take. Consider, and despair. Mock essays as a practice for GCSEs. The book being studied was an Inspector Calls. I can't remember what the essay was supposed to be about, but it definitely wasn't about how J.B. Priestley actually worked for the FBI and assassinated JFK. They got 1/40. The 1 mark apparently for stating that J.B. Priestley wrote an Inspector Calls in the opening paragraph. Also, someone spent an entire paragraph on an essay about of mice and men going into way too much detail about the whorehouse, and not in a way relevant to the text. I did of mice and men last year. I was extremely tempted to write about how much of a thought Curly's wife was, but instead I just called her a Pop-Tart. Had an English essay assignment about horse meat during the horse meat scandal in Europe. One girl actually wrote an whole essay about 2 horses meeting each other. I once had a 9th grade student suggest that death row inmates be sent overseas to fight wars instead of having soldiers do it. That was pretty amazing. The Soviets did this to the worst criminals during WW2. They were offered to redeem their crimes by blood and usually sent them on difficult attacks on the most heavily fortified parts of the front. ITA, the class that was basically a science course for non-science majors, 10% of them were actually really interested in science but just going a different career path. 80% of them were decent students but just not science people, so they worked hard to earn a decent grade and get out. And 10% were people who probably shouldn't be in college at all and left me baffled as to how they got into the university. One fine member of this last 10% turned in their final essay and it was literally entirely plagiarized. They were told multiple times that when they turn in their essay online it goes automatically through a software that checks their writing against a huge reference base and highlights areas that are extremely similar or identical to existing works. Each source in a different color. Most papers had maybe a sentence or 2 highlighted, usually by coincidence because it was a simple sentence, or because they actually properly quoted something when necessary. This person's essay looked like a majestic double rainbow because everything was highlighted. I don't think they had one unique sentence in the entire paper. It was just chunks copied and pasted from about 10 sources. Every now and then, one of the copied areas was introduced as a quote, i.e., it says in Wikipedia entire paragraph, citation. I can't believe they even bothered to turn it in. Literally not doing the assignment would have been a better choice, as plagiarism can get you kicked out, but not turning anything in would just be a 0. Ah, good old, get it submitted, plagiarism software. So helpful. Before my college got that, teachers had to Google suspicious phrases in essays and write down the location of type-copied text, which took ages. What always amazed me with the classic essay of many colors, or its stablemate, essay all one color, was that when confronted, the student would almost always completely deny plagiarizing and claim it was just a coincidence that huge chunks of text were the same. They would just lie to your face. Occasionally they would act very confused and say that they didn't understand how to quote or cite sources. Occasionally I believed them, although it wasn't a great defense, as the course they were writing the essay for was Essay Writing Skills 101. I'm at AH University teaching first year physics students. For the first week the assignment was a really simple calculation just to get acquainted with the online assignment system. One of my students just submitted a PDF with the words, "I don't expect anyone to actually read these assignments," in big red letters. He now has to redo the assignment and participate in an extra lab day to be allowed to go to the exam. A calculus class I took in college used an online system like that for assignments 13 years ago, so it was a bigger deal back then. If you submitted an incorrect answer it would show you the solution, then change the numbers and ask you to try again. Frequently, I wanted to just see the solution without having to make a guess attempt first, so I'd write something like Professor, Calculus Prof's name, is a hottie, which he was, and just click to see what the real answer was. I did this for weeks. One day in class he mentions that, upon reviewing the wrong answers people got, students seemed to be making this common mistake. Unfortunately, I could never look him in the face again. But I did get an A in the class. Everything you submit in those systems is read. Everything. I taught high school for 5 years, but by far the worst paper I ever graded came from a 35 years old in a master's level course that I was an adjunct for. This was in a semi-prestigious business technology program at a large university in the US. He used 17 commas in one sentence. It was the mother of all run-on sentences. Imagine writing a 200+ word paragraph, but remove all periods and find a way to connect everything with commas. I should add that English is his native language. He's just one of those people that thinks more words, longer sentences equals intelligent thought. Granted, when considering the structure of a hypothetical sentence, although its final construction would appear rather ungainly, would parse in a rather confusing manner, and would likely be much better expressed through a more straightforward series of separate statements, it wouldn't necessarily be incorrect to say that such a sentence, properly constructed, with a subject, a predicate, and perhaps an additional independent clause, and secured by an appropriately placed conjunction or semicolon, while nonetheless thoroughly dotted, or perhaps even pollocked, as it were, with a generous portion of commas, which, as we should all know from our schoolyard days, serve a vital purpose in conveying causal interruptions to the reader, would nonetheless remain grammatically sound, at least from a purely technical perspective, owing the fact that the term run-on sentence applies specifically to sentences explicitly lacking in proper connections between independent clauses, while, on the other hand, sentences suffering from an excess of such connections are called, for lack of a better expression, a mess. This is a bit geeky, but I once had a student submit an annotated bibliography. They were required to find 15 sources on a topic and give short annotations. 3 found 10, 4 of which were interviews they were going to conduct themselves in the future, 1 of which was with their mother. It is the first and only time I have had to annotate a paper with "you cannot cite sources which do not, as yet, exist." Not a teacher myself, but my chem teacher warned us in the beginning of the year that she makes assignments and post PDFs online with the wrong answers. Despite this, plenty of kids constantly copied off the PDFs, and so my teacher would easily know they cheated. English teacher in the Netherlands here. I had a student once who needed to write a nice letter to a friend about sending some books and wishing them a nice holiday. In the end, She translated some Dutch sentences literally, which then became a letter I had to read while suppressing a volley of laughter. Unintended. Half of the letter became sexual innuendos. Things like "I wish you a lot of fun reading these books" were written as "I'll pleasure you while you read books," and "I like milk" became "I like MILF." Needless to say, I had a great time with teaching her, because she'd often come up with those gems in assignment. Not an essay assignment, but my music performance teacher at college said one of the degree students wanted to do the bass part of Paranoid for his final performance. We had a first aid section in gym class. For the CPR exam, we were moved to a classroom at the bottom of 3 steps. Everyone had a head and a lung bag, but the dummy body was outside, by the steps. The teacher would call on a student, they'd go out, and he'd test them. This one kid goes out, says this guy might have fallen down the stairs. I can't do CPR. I'm calling 911 and waiting for the paramedics, because if there's a possibility of neck spine injury, moving a person is only going to make it worse. He passed, but teacher announced that said stunt would only be accepted once. In 8th grade we had to write a short essay on who our biggest hero is. Most people wrote their mom, dad, favorite uncle, act. I wrote about Captain America. Got a detention for that one. Edit. Feel like a lot of the people who replied are maybe missing the point here. I was the asshole in this situation, not the teacher. Why though? Lots of people look up to fictional characters. Sure, I understand if you got a CETA for it or something, but why detention? Obligatory. Not a teacher, but post. My friend in high school was supposed to write a research paper on General Lee. Instead, he wrote a 12-page paper about the General Lee car from Dukes of Hazzard, complete with pictures and quotes. I was impressed when he received a D. I am not a teacher, so forgive me. Can't let this go without referring you all to the wonderful epic that is Kevin posted by Noah the Red some years back. It's one of the only pieces of Reddit I've actually cried with laughter over. See and enjoy Who's the Dumbest Person You've Ever Met? AskReddit webpage. Was a TA tutor for a 200 level college writing class. One of the guys I tutored handed me a 100% genuine examination of Brony culture. Not only a breakdown of characters in the show, but a discussion about the actual fandom from popular websites, fan creators, community hubs, significant events in the fandom's lifespan, and the significance of Ahem Rule 34 content. I had people give me essays on shows anime fandoms before, but particular one was hard to chew through. I once gave a writing assignment for the students to tell what they wanted to be when they grew up. One student said he wanted to be an astronaut. He said he would build the rocket in his backyard, and it would shoot him right up to the moon. He said he would survive by eating moon rocks. He was a senior in high school. I wrote my college entrance essay on toilet bowls and how I think they should be shaped to minimize splashback and leg cramps. I still got in, so that's great, but it was one of my worst ideas. Back in high school, one of my classmates' literature class were reading The Hobbit, followed by submitting a written assignment based on given essay questions. 1,500 words. Spoiler alert. The guy didn't read the book, so his friends decided to tell him Killy and Philly drowned with their donkeys when the donkeys went mad because they couldn't cut themselves loose. As the plot progressed, the dude asked why Killy and Philly remained in the plot if they already died. Come the night before the essay deadline, everyone was trading notes and checking word counts. When asked about his word count, my friend I forgot what the original essay question was, but this dude turned in a 500-word essay on why hobbits do not have to wear shoes. For warmth, because they have hairy feet. Edit. People were bickering about warmth versus protection of feet hair as reason not to wear shoes. I knew someone in high school who got drunk before doing an assignment on future careers he'd be interested in. He wound up writing about how he'd like to be a porn star. After the teacher graded it, he took the moron aside and asked him just what the hell he was thinking, and he had to try and explain himself without mentioning that he'd been drunk because he underage. I still don't understand why he turned in the assignment in the first place. Surely a 0 was better than that. I used to do stuff like that in high school. I just figured no one was taking the subject matter seriously, only the writing. I did a presentation about how my dream job was to work at McDonald's. I made a high B. In public speaking class we had to interview someone about their career and give a presentation about it. A good friend of mine got up in front of class and said he interviewed a Zambini driver. He said Zambini instead of Zamboni about 50x times in his speech. I don't think the teacher was too hard on him, even though he totally made the whole thing up. That is more than a valid career. It isn't easy. Not any dick can do the trick. And if you do really well, you can rake in a lot of cash. Fuck that teacher. Man should follow his dream. Not a teacher, but pretty sure I can comfortably speak for them here. In 8th grade we had a Holocaust WW2 project and my friend was assigned the topic of Mein Kampf. He's kinda a knucklehead sometimes but overall decently smart. He tells me the day we turned in our project that Mein Kampf was a man who wrote a biography about Hitler from an American POW camp. To this day I can't explain how he came to that conclusion. He said he used wiki answers and Quora as sources, so that might explain it. We had worked on the project for 3 weeks and I was kinda baffled that he managed to bungle it that badly after we worked on it so extensively. Anyways, suppose teacher had a laugh. She gave him a 54 effort and let him redo the project. To a degree. Not a teacher, but had a real bad teacher my freshman and sophomore year of high school. After about a year and a half of having this history teacher, there were patterns that my friend and I began picking up on. This guy was a creep. He was 60+ years old, had proposed and been denied by at least 4 female teachers at the school, and would host classes where his ego would be satisfied by just having students ask him personal questions. So a little backstory first off. He clearly picked favorites. He hated the foreign exchange students and their homework grades were almost always lower. The hot girls were not only all forced to sit up front, but somehow always got better grades. And everyone else, it seemed to be based upon length. One day during lunch, my friend tells me something along the lines of, "Dude, I literally saw him take out a ruler with letter grades on it and grade Personx's homework just by how long it was. Picture a foot ruler that just had F up top. And then the further down it went, the better the grade was." My friend decided to test it one day. For ancient Rome homework, he started the first few lines like normal. Then he proceeded to talk about how Chuck Norris fought in the Colosseum against a T-Rex. I mean, like it was a solid paragraph and a half in detail about this brawl. He then wrapped it up with a few normal sounding sentences. It was a complete page. He received an A. Now, as much as I hated this teacher, I'm going to be honest, I just took advantage of the system. I never took a risk like my friend did, but I absolutely did repeat sentences and half-ass assignments from then on to receive a B. Not a teacher, but a kid in my senior English class. Smart kid, mind you. Thought he'd be a smartass and do his senior paper on the Harry Potter series. He assumed that because he was a smart kid and loved Harry Potter, it would be super easy. He ended up procrastinating a ton and got a C on it. We had just spent a week over Henry VIE this week, as in this happened today. To show that the students could demonstrate knowledge over the subject matter, they had a choice of assignments they could do. One of the choices was to write a brief summary, or draw something that related to one of Henry VIE's wives. Following that, they had to write a quote at the bottom of the page. A kid wrote a quote from Jane Seymour, which sounds great until you realize she wrote a quote from the actress, not the third wife of Henry VIE. In case you are wondering, the quote was, "Even though I make those movies, I find myself wishing that more of those magic moments could happen in real life." I once turned in a 500-word essay over what leadership meant to me. At one point in the essay I wrote, "Here are 87 synonyms for the word leadership in alphabetical order." I got a B. Not a teacher, but there was one time a professor said he'd only look at the cover page, first page, and works cited. The topic was hard to research and write on because there weren't many scholarly sources, and we had to turn it in as a paper copy with no digital file. I did the cover page, sources cited, wrote half page of content and blew it up enough to cover the first page, and I left the rest of the pages blank. Got an A on the paper and in the class. I remember once my English teacher told us to write a rough draft for a paper we were doing. She asked us to bring it in, and said that she wouldn't read them but will give us credit if we brought it in. It was like 15% of our grade. I went home, typed up one paragraph, copy-pasted it until it was the right length, and printed it out. Easy A, right? Well, I forgot to bring the draft in, and got a 0 on it. Literally the easiest grade ever, and I blew it. Not a teacher, but in 7th grade social studies I did my final project on the history of anime. Also there was a guy on our anime who wrote an essay on the physics of big animateds. The history of anime is a pretty legit subject for a paper. It ties into WWII, imperialism, corporate versus government influence in society, changing social norms, etc. Engineers, answering the questions no one really asked because they were bored. I want to say JPL started the same way. For a researched argument essay for college-level English composition, this student's thesis statement was people should eliminate their negative views of student athletes because, as we all know, student athletes always give 110%. Her argument was basically that student athletes should receive more resources than other students because they work so much harder, even though they, already do. I did a pretty thorough job explaining why the thesis was problematic, and my students had a total of 3 drafts for this assignment. But rather than working to improve the problems with her argument, she doubled down on them. And in the final draft, her thesis had evolved to "You should eliminate your negative views of student athletes because..." Not a teacher, but I went back to school at 35 and was in our autobiographical writing class with 20-year-olds. We had to peer review each other's paper, and this one kid wrote about how he wanted to be a professional soccer player. It was absolutely riddled with spelling and grammar errors, especially for a 300-level college writing class. He spent a page describing how in his country it was called football and not soccer. He claimed English wasn't his first language, but he spoke it perfectly. The weirdest thing was that it seemed to be out of date. He made reference to how he wanted to keep playing until 2014, even though it was 2016, and it referenced him still being in high school. I called him out on submitting an old essay he wrote for a different class, but he never responded. In fact, no one was really all that harsh on him. Most of the comments, it was online and in person, were positive and how they liked the story. So I guess I was a jerk. His other essay was much better, and I still stand by the fact that he just handed in something he previously wrote. But he spoke it perfectly. It's actually really common for ESL students to have great oral skills and really lacking writing skills, like nearly native levels of speech but poor writing skills. Source: used to tutor ESL kids during undergrad. In a journalism class, I assigned kids to write a game story. They could watch any game they wanted and write up the next day article for it. One kid C&P's a Guardian article on a soccer match with the image used for it on top of it. I teach music production at a state university. One of my classes is titled MIDI and Digital Music Production. I wrote the entire curriculum based around using the software Ableton Live. Every project throughout the semester is done in this software. For their final project, I ask them to use all of the knowledge they have gained from the previous projects in order to create a finished track song. For his final project, one genius student turned in the demo project that Ableton Live defaults to upon opening up the software for the first time. I lolled. Not sure if this is exactly what you are looking for, but back in 10th grade, I tricked my teacher into giving my oral presentation for the book, Around the World in 80 Days. I had just moved to the school and was pretty shy. My first week there, I was assigned the book to read and had 2 weeks to finish and give a presentation on it. We had just moved there because a hurricane had demolished the place my dad worked at before in another, so they relocated in this new area. I was still pretty depressed from have to move and lose all my friends, so I think managed to read maybe 10-15 pages of the book total. When it came time to do the presentation, I got called up to the front of the class to do it. I didn't know anything about the book, so I started to talk about the first few pages that I had read. However, I was so shy and nervous that I would have these really long pauses after every 3 to 4 words of what I was saying. Since I look so out of sorts, I guess the teacher felt bad for me and started saying things to prod me along with the presentation. For example, he would say, "Wasn't it neat when character such and such did this?" and I would agree with him. He would continue on with, "And then characters did this and that," and I would continue to agree with him. After about 5 or 6 interactions like that, he jumped up and just started talking about everything that happened in the book like I wasn't even there and he was teaching it to the class himself. Come to find out, it was his favorite book and he loved talking about it. So I ended up getting an A on that assignment. One of my college students submitted a plagiarized essay that was an exact duplicate of an essay written by Vinton Cerf, co-founder of TCP/IP, in the 1960s. The first clue she had cheated was that all of her citations were from arcane journals from the 50s and 60s. The second clue was that the paper was clearly written by an academic while the student herself was a non-native speaker. The best part is that she swore up and down she wrote the paper herself and would give me dirty looks whenever I saw her outside of class. At the end of the semester I smugly told her to have a delightful summer. Not me, but a friend of mine in high school had to submit an essay about hard work. He wrote an essay about finding hot aliens and he gave them his hard work. He got 100. He wrote an essay about dicking down aliens and got 100. Luck and charisma stood through the fucking roof. So on the final I gave, I had an essay question. I called home to let her mom know her son copied off of the girl next to him. The mom immediately accused me of jumping to conclusions, because perhaps the girl copied off of him. I then read her the first line of his essay. "I don't really know how to answer this because I'm on my period today and my boyfriend has been a real asshole." Mayo, what kind of essay question would that even be an acceptable answer for the girl? While I, like most folks in this thread, am not a teacher, I did have an affinity for creative rhetoric as a student, and it was never more evident than when the time came for us to apply for college scholarships. The high school where I attended my junior and senior years was progressive in a number of ways, the most notable of those being that everything, with very few exceptions, was done on computers. Look, it was cutting edge at the time, okay? There was also a significant focus on college applications and essays, and a member of the faculty devoted entirely to helping our 80-something graduating students with the admissions process. One aspect of this woman's job was to assist in finding scholarships for which each of us would be eligible, and apparently, she felt that I should apply for the one entitled Overcoming Adversity. Now, while I did later discover that everyone had been sent an application to that particular scholarship, I took special note of it because I, a white male from an upper middle class family full of folks with doctorate degrees, wasn't eligible for anything else, and besides, the only requirement was a 3-paragraph essay. So, more in an effort to amuse myself than to actually accomplish something, I decided to write what I hoped would be a heartfelt and seemingly earnest description of the hardships that I'd experienced. There was only one problem: I'd never had any such hardships. Oh, sure, there had been some tough times and scary situations, but nothing, by that point, beyond almost dying during an ill-advised caving expedition, which I didn't think would qualify. In fact, the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I'd never even had the opportunity to overcome adversity. Just like that, it hit me. Less than half an hour later, I had crafted my essay. The title, perhaps appropriately, was Overcoming a Lack of Adversity. In it, I described how I'd never had the privilege of being underprivileged, and how I'd been deprived of the chance to rise above my limitations as a result. I further explained that if I was given the scholarship, it would count not only as someone recognizing my handicap, but also as giving me the chance to conquer it. A couple of months later, the principal rolled his eyes as he announced me as the recipient of the scholarship. Evidently I was the only one who had applied. TLDR, I overcame adversity with bullshit. At least you were self-aware enough to realize you hadn't experienced hardship. I knew people in high school who thought their parents refusing to give them money for weed would have counted. Razzies, your stories never cease to amaze me. Eloquent writing and perfect timing. Hilarious every time. Thank you. Sadly, I don't think my sense of humor was appreciated by the school's faculty. For my college's supplementary application, one of the questions was, what's the most valuable piece of advice you've ever received? One of my friends wrote about how his grandfather told him to appreciate small breasts on women, and all the ways they were superior. Like, I know my college is liberal, but I still wonder how he got in. I wrote an essay on why SpongeBob SquarePants doesn't have square pants for a college class. Debated that topic for quite a while. Not a teacher, just like 90% of the rest of us here. In high school, we had to write an original poem. One enterprising student turned in a copy of Robert Frost's Fire and Ice. He didn't think the teacher would have heard of it before, even though she had told the class that Frost was her favorite poet, and she had it on a poster behind her desk. This is just to say, I have plagiarized the poem that was behind your desk, and which you will probably recognize while grading. Forgive me, it was terrific. So fiery, and so icy. I just started teaching and already I have had 2 really fun assignment answers. I asked my 17-year-old students in a beginner chemistry course how to find out if a beaker of water contains salt or not without tasting it. One kid suggesting putting a freshwater fish in the beaker and see if it survives. If not, it contains some salts. Another student suggesting putting her finger in the beaker and if it burns it must have salts in it as they ramp up the pH value of the water. How could she know about pH yet and not what salt is? And you should never put a finger in a solution you don't know what is ever. I am not a teacher but I was a TA in a freshman high school class. As a part of the class the kids had to take a test on the United States. It was essentially a blank map with numbers and you would identify the state and write it down. I've never been so ashamed of kids in my life. This was a long time ago so I can't remember everything well but I remember the states Fontana and Minnesota. I can certainly understand not knowing which state was which but I do expect you'd know which states existed. This will get buried but I love this story. My mom has been a teacher for a long time. About 20 years ago, she had a student who wrote a book report on Jim Ryan, the US runner congressman who broke the 4-minute mile. Among other impressive accomplishments, the front of the book had a picture of him running, with one of his legs bent backwards mid-stride. So naturally, a student who absolutely did not read the book wrote a book report about Jim Ryan, the amazing one-legged runner. She still tells this story all the time. Not a teacher, but I once wrote an essay worth 50% of my final grade which had nothing to do with the actual subject matter. English is my second language, and I wrote way above my grade level. So she set up a big meeting with me to explain to me that the paper was absolute garbage. But since the class was about English, which I clearly understood, she couldn't justify having me fail the course. She was a good teacher. My prof told me a story about how he had assigned a student a report about metal cord welding and he handed in a word-for-word copy of a Wikipedia article about metalcore music. High school students had to write a paper on a topic they felt strongly about. One gem went on and on about how Asian kids aren't bad and can't seem to cut a break and how exhausting it must be for them to always be talked about, and so on. I call my student over and ask her what in the ever-loving fuck she is talking about and she replies, "Miss, you asked us to write about a topic we feel strongly about." People wrote about abortions, racism, politics. I wrote about euthanasia. Thank God she said the last part slowly because it hit me like a ton of bricks. "Abby, do you mean euthanasia?" Abby eye rolls. "That's what I said. Euthanasia. Everyone is always saying how they are against them. Like how horrible. What are they? Nazis?" I was literally stunned silent. In high school, I had a class where I was sat at a computer desk with 4 other girls. We were talking about research papers and started talking about euthanasia. After a while one girl slams down her pen and is like, "Enough. I don't care about no damn Chinese kids. What about the kids here?" We all stopped and looked at each other then busted out laughing. We had to explain what euthanasia really was. Then she was like, oh, who cares, it's their life. Then started typing like she hadn't gotten so extremely upset about kids in China. Rankin, is that you? I had a high school debate teacher who assigned euthanasia as a topic. One of his students did too much research on Asian youth. So she wrote about the old overdone obviously fake euthanasia. Sounds sort of like euthanasia joke. When I was in high school we had to write satires about modern problems cultures. Well, mine was titled "Crack the Cure for Obesity." I thought it was really well done paper. School officials did not share my sense of humor. My 11th grade history teacher told this story about a test he gave on one occasion. When the papers were handed in, it was obvious that one student cheated. His answers matched the answers of the person sitting next to him perfectly, including spelling errors and other small details. If the source student wrote President Lincoln as an answer for question number 6, then the cheater wrote President Lincoln as the answer for number 6 as well. Each pair of answers matched, except for the last one. As with most tests, questions grew more difficult as it progressed. The last one was especially difficult and the source student didn't know the answer, so he wrote "I don't know." The cheater wrote "I don't know either." I'm like 99% sure that this is kind of an old joke. Not saying you're lying, but your teacher was probably just telling a joke. I am no teacher, but I think this story is worth telling. The most badass essay story was when I was in college. We had an artsy professor, the one that calls you out for being a minute late, going to the bathroom, talking, being on your phone, etc. Just an overall non-forgiving teacher. So one day we had a fairly large essay due and it was due as a hard copy at the beginning of class. A guy in our lecture, reminded that this was over a 100-person lecture, was late to class and to turn in his paper. As he walked to the front of the lecture, the teacher said something along the lines of, "Too bad you are too late. You will have to take a 0 on this one." Maybe it was a seriously reduced grade rather than a 0, but you get my point. The guy with full confidence looks at our prof and goes, "What's my name?" The teacher was confused and laughed a little and said, "I don't know. Why does that matter?" Without saying another word, he took the stack of essays on the stool that were already turned in and he cut open into the middle of the stack and threw his paper in between all of them, picked up the stack, realigned them and walked out. He didn't say anything, but the look on his face was pure savagery. Half the class was stunned along with the teacher who had been outsmarted by his genius move, and the other half just started to applaud him on his way out. Legend. I still can't believe I got a B for an assignment I did on why World War II was a good thing, which included an entire paragraph on how culling the human population was in the best interest of humanity. Somehow I even managed to justify both Auschwitz and Nanking. Something about the profits of seized assets and saving resources.